Minister, in your speech, you touched on a number of occasions using the phrase "with the greatest needs," those with the greatest needs. Now, you said that the clear instruction from government in terms of eligibility was to focus on those with the greatest needs. But what I'm worried about is you also spoke about to make the criteria for the scheme very broad would open up new categories of eligibility, and you are worried about the effects of the cost of that. Can I ask you then, is it a case that from a situation whereby you're trying to help people, you're actually going to narrow the parameters of those that are going to be helped because there's an overreaching arm from the influence of deeper on this, and that in effect those that require help can find themselves on the outside because of a fear that this is going to spiral out of control, if I'm reading between the lines of what you're saying? Because of course you have the issues of cost to deal with in your role as Minister, but of course the rationale is to allow people fully participate in the workforce, in social events, for them to have a full life that they can participate in. So can I ask you on that, is there an overreaching arm here that's really going to restrict the ability of this scheme to achieve what the Ombudsman is seeking, what all public representatives are seeking on behalf of people? You asked, that's my first question. The second question is, you asked in terms of, or you spoke about the numbers and estimating the numbers. And there's obviously currently 4,700 receiving interim payments. Can I ask you how you're estimating the numbers of what you're likely going to have in terms of, obviously, in terms of finalising the criteria? So what is the final likely number going to be? And is it being determined by a cap on what monies are available to you? And again, you talked about helping those in the greatest need. I really would like, Chairperson, if the Minister could quantify that for us this morning or this afternoon. I am particularly worried about that and the scope and the amount of people that it could help. And again, this influence of deeper on that. That would be my second question. And finally, Cathaoirleach, the Minister touched on talking about people and using public transport in terms of the rationale for the requirement for this scheme. And if people are not able to use public transport, well, this cites an example. Even, Minister, where we have people who can use public transport and who are acquiring public transport to get into the city, not every public transport vehicle actually can facilitate those, whether they be in a wheelchair or so forth. And it's hit or miss in terms of the bus that pulls up, especially on provincial routes into the city. And that is just simply unacceptable. And in terms of your role with Bus Éireann and Minister Ross in actually making sure that people, they have to ring ahead. Now, we have a problem at the moment that nearly because of a semi-industrial issue with Bus Éireann, buses aren't coming full stop. But imagine if you need a specific bus to be able to come in and do your job, and you can't get on that bus because it doesn't have the actual requirements to allow you to board and become a passenger. Thanks, Chairperson.
Okay, so questions about impact, questions about numbers, questions about the most in need. So please.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank Deputy Cassells for raising these very important issues. And in relation to the greatest need, as you know, there's 4,700 people already receiving that. Now, there are people putting forward the proposals that if we broaden it out and go further, you could be going up as high as 20,000 people. That's the first thing. In relation to, while at the moment, while this legislation is being finalised, it's important to know that the 4,700 are getting the €208.50 per month. That's an annual cost of 9.3 million, just to let you know that. So that's going on at the moment. I want to ensure my own personal preference is to, first of all, target those most in need, but then to broaden it out to people who have broader needs, but of course have serious disability and mobility problems. That is my own vision for the piece of legislation. The numbers, I mentioned the numbers there. Again, I have to emphasise, Deputy Cassells, that these are estimate numbers that from my experience from talking to colleagues, both in the Shannon and the Dáil, and also from talking to disability groups, you could literally go from 4,700 to a possible max of 20,000. Now, in relation to the funding questions you raised, there's always a debate about funding limitations and where you spend the money on. And of course, as I said, when you're talking about spending public money, I mean, of course, I have lots of ideas and proposals during the talks on the estimates when I went in to talk to Pascal and the Department of Public Expenditure. And you might put in 10 things, you might end up by getting 4 or 5. That's part of negotiations. So in my situation, what I'm saying is we're trying to rebuild and invest in disability services. This transport support scheme is part of that. I'm taking a step-by-step approach. I think it's very, very important. There'll always be funding limitations, and that's something I totally agree with you, and that is a concern. There's no point in saying it's not, and the Department of Public Expenditure will make you go through the hoops to convince them that this is credible and what are your costings like, etc. There are all sorts of figures bandied around about the cost of the legislation, but that won't be finalised for another while. All I'll say to you is in relation to, the other question you mentioned was, besides funding, was the whole issue of accessibility. Just to let you know as well, what you raised there is a very, very important issue. And I know you're best buddies with Minister Ross, and I've raised those issues with as Minister for Transport, as you know. But I know, on a serious note, you know that we have launched a National Disability Inclusion Strategy in July. We've had our first meeting there a month ago, and every single department has been asked to come up with proposals and concrete proposals in relation to how you're going to do something or assist people with disabilities. Every single minister has been told to do the same thing, by the way. I've asked them by Christmas, give me a couple of things that you were going to do in your department that would assist persons with disability. So to answer your question, the accessibility is really up there with the Department of Transport. Now, in fairness to Dublin Bus and Lewis, they have improved over the last number of years, but there's a hell of a lot that haven't improved. And I launched a campaign there recently as well about the disabled spaces on bus not to be blocked up by people with buggies and bags and all sorts of things as well, to make sure that the person with disability has accessibility. But just to give you a commitment that that accessibility issue will be dealt with very, very strongly on the National Inclusion Strategy. And I think we're having our next meeting on the 8th of December, where the Department of Transport will be reporting back to me to see where they've made progress on those issues. But I kind of say, your point raised is very, very important. It's unacceptable that people with a physical disability and with major mobility are still having to ring up the night before to get access to a public transport. And I also, by the way, cannot exclude the private transporters as well. They are going to be included in this as well. We've got to ensure that if we're talking about equality, if we're talking about the rights of persons with disability, access is a very important part of that. But what I'll do is, when I get more progress on that particular issue, Deputy, I'll come back to you as well. Thank you. So,
Deputy Cassells, you had questions about the sense of the greatest need. Are you clear about that, and also the numbers estimates?
Yeah, I mean, look, I appreciate that the Minister is perhaps not going to disclose the overall, but he gave us an upper figure of 20,000. Obviously, you have 4,700 at the moment. Yeah. You've given us an upper figure of 20,000.
Yeah, an estimate number.
I mean, obviously, then within that, you've done a preliminary work on what you think. What would come in under the full scope to be able to give us a figure of 20,000 here today. So, I mean, again, is there an issue in terms of, you've been told, here's the limit of funding that's available. Within that, you're now going to have to frame the legislation to make sure that the scope does not allow it go beyond that. Is that how effectively you're going to end up framing this?
The honest answer is no, because I'll tell you, the talks are still going on, but deeper in relation to the Department of Public Expenditure, and so I can't say no at this stage. Of course, I know what I want to do, and how I get there is a different debate. But the bottom line is, I want to ensure that the bill will go to the maximum amount of people, but also the priority within that. I have a caveat there: is the most needy people have to be prioritised. But if it comes to a decision between getting this piece of legislation for a particular so many million, and either succeeding and getting a little bit or getting half it, I'll make that decision at the time. But there's no final. Nobody's closing me down yet on the debate. Just to let you know that I'm pushing for the maximum, and I know the maximum figure in my head, and I'm negotiating that. But the bottom line is, when we're finalised that conclusions, we'll have some sort of idea. So the answer to your question directly is there's no. I'm not holding back on the figures, holding back on the numbers. I'm pushing for the maximum, and if I get a reasonable accommodation. And I know that a lot of deputies and senators in the room here want to support me for the maximum, because you have ideas yourselves in relation to assisting people with disabilities.